everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this afternoon. I am going to be talking about the Federal Trade Commission's amendments to the telemarketing sales rule, and hopefully answering a lot of the questions that we've already been getting about these. Just a few housekeeping matters. We are recording this, and it will be available on our website. It usually takes a day or two to get that up. But if you want to share this, feel free to do that, and it will be available at mslawgroup.com. So as we get started, of course, the usual disclaimer, although I am a lawyer and I love giving legal advice, I'm not giving legal advice on this webinar. Certainly reach out to us if you have any questions or would like clarifications about what the FTC has released. So these are the FTC headlines that we're looking at. The FTC has not amended the telemarketing sales rule in any substantial way. Especially the areas that we're going to address today since it was originally implemented, which, gosh, I think is close to 30 years now. I might be exaggerating that a little bit, but it's been quite some time. And so the FTC really did a thorough review in some areas that we're going to be looking at today. The headlines, though, because these are the sexy things that the FTC wants to talk about, is that they have added some business-to-business protections against fraud in the TSR. So that's something we're going to talk about. Also, they have included artificial intelligence and specifically certain types of scam calls in the telemarketing sales rule. The pre-recorded messages, telemarketing, or in AI being the same as a pre-recorded message is something that we're already familiar with from what the Federal Communications Commission has done recently with the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, or the TCPA. So for those of you that are very familiar with the industry, you'll see some redundancy between those types of things. So let's go ahead and get started. So high level, let's look at the amendments that the FTC or the Federal Trade Commission is putting into effect. First of all, we had some questions before the webinar about when the new revisions will take place. And for most of them, it's 180 days after the publication in the Federal Register. So that's what you'll be looking for. You can set notices in the Federal Register to notify you. We obviously will also be blogging about when this is published in the Federal Register so that you'll be able to track when those deadlines start to kick in. Also, the big headline that I took away when I first was looking at what the FTC had done was that it was extending some of the telemarketing sales rules applications to business calls. Obviously, that's something that we always pay close attention to. We see some states that are already increasing their telemarketing and consumer protection requirements to businesses. And so the Federal Trade Commission is following that trend. Most of the things we see, though, for the changes in the B2B area have to do with providing protections to businesses, and they were primarily focusing on small businesses, but providing protections to businesses against certain types of fraud calls. So this was not a wide application of business to business or wide application to business telemarketing, which is, I think, what the concern was, that the companies that are doing B2B calls would now have to be scrubbing those against the do not call list and doing those types of things. That is not what was included in these amendments. As I mentioned, it brings AI calls under the jurisdiction of the FTC. They did this in an interesting way. As many of you will likely recall, it's been about 5 years ago now, I would say, maybe a little bit longer, that the Federal Trade Commission took a really keen interest in what soundboard technology was doing. They brought soundboard technology under the purview of the telemarketing sales rule. And this is after the FTC had previously issued an informal staff letter that said soundboard technology was not the type of pre-recorded message that the telemarketing sales rule was intending to regulate. They changed that about 5 years ago. And so when looking at how to bring artificial intelligence under the telemarketing sales rule, they looked at soundboard technology and have determined that the soundboard technology that's being used or soundboard software, I should say, is also going to include artificial intelligence because it basically uses the same type of technology, although obviously with soundboard, we're talking about pre-recorded instead of artificially generated. But now for the pre-recorded message requirements in the telemarketing sales rule, that will include artificial intelligence. The primary thing that we're looking at with artificial intelligence and the requirement to comply with the telemarketing sales rule is that it requires consent, and that consent must be in writing and signed by the person providing the consent. And the FTC, before the Federal Communications Commission for the TCPA, had already taken steps to include one-to-one consent, or the type of consent you need to place telemarketing calls using a pre-recorded message, or now AI. So all of those things that you're familiar with from your compliance efforts with the TCPA that will take effect at the beginning of next year, that will now apply to the telemarketing sales rule as well for artificial intelligence and that one-to-one consent. There were significant record retention revisions, and we're going to go over those in detail. It might get a little tedious as we're going through that, but I thought of all of the revisions to the telemarketing sales rule that have the potential for causing companies issues. It's the record retention laws. Also, I think that as we're looking at some of these new record retention requirements, it is going to require changes in written policies as well as procedures to make sure that you are retaining those records that will be required to be retained, and now for 5 years. Many of the record keeping requirements for the telemarketing sales rule were previously 2 years. Those have been increased to 5 years. And if those records are related to contracts between service providers and, telemarketers / service providers and sellers, it's 5 years from the end of the contract between those parties. So, for purposes of record retention, it is going to require, I'm assuming, some retooling of your technology, how you're collecting records, how you're storing those records, and how long you're storing those records for. Also, for you, those of you that are in the charitable solicitation space or professional fundraisers, you are aware that there is an exception for professional fundraisers that are calling on behalf of charities if they are calling prior donors. And so many of the requirements to the telemarketing sales rule do not apply to those calls by professional fundraisers that otherwise would apply. Because as you recall, under the Patriot Act, again, going back some time here, whereas all charitable and professional fundraiser calls were exempt from the telemarketing sales rule, the Patriot Act brought in professional fundraisers and started regulating what they were required to do under the TSR, and in particular, the type of consent that was required for them to make telephone calls. Well, the FTC has now clarified what that definition of prior donor is. And it requires that there actually have been a donation that was made within the previous 2 years. And corresponding with that, the TSR now, or when it takes effect, these amendments, it will also require that there be record keeping to be able to demonstrate that those donations had occurred within the last 2 years. Also, there were some interesting changes regarding the formatting of records, and in particular, the call detail records. The FTC is now requiring that for international numbers, it's in the E164 format, and that all records of time are recorded under UTC time. And so that, again, is probably something you're going to need to look at with your dialing software to make sure that you are meeting those requirements. As I mentioned, B2B calls are now covered under, or will be covered under the telemarketing sales rule. And it requires that for businesses calling other businesses that they not engage in any type of deceptive telemarketing acts or practices. And that basically means that for any material aspects of that transaction, whatever it is they're trying to sell from one business to another, that there can't be any misrepresentations about the material facts about that product or service or cost, or about how that transaction will occur. For those of you that are familiar with the term UDAP, unfair, deceptive acts or practices, which is basically what's prohibited under most consumer protection laws, what the FTC is protecting against is those types of things now under the telemarketing sales rule. Basically, if you look at what's considered an unfair or deceptive act or practice, it's now going to be prohibited with regard to business calls. Again, business calls were not brought under the do not call requirements, so don't be alarmed or confused that that has occurred. As I mentioned, artificial intelligence is now covered. It replaces the term digital soundboard technology to soundboard technology, or I'm sorry, digital soundboard to soundboard technology. And that's because the FTC wanted to broaden, for purposes of application under the TSR, not just soundboard technology, but also this artificial intelligence. And that's how they did it. As I mentioned, it's now treated as a pre-recorded message. And so for purposes of the type of consent that you need, you'll need the same type of consent for an AI call as you would for a pre-recorded message. When you're looking at your company, whether you're a seller or a telemarketer or a service provider, we're really looking at these primary areas that are affected by the rulemakings, or by the rulemaking. So the types of things you're going to want to do after this webinar is look at these areas within your entity and make sure that you are meeting these new requirements. We're going to talk here about contracts in a minute. You will be required to make contract revisions to make sure that you are covering items that are required to be covered in the contract under these new amendments. Also, significant changes, as I mentioned, for record keeping. Both the types of records that you have to keep, the length of time you have to keep them for, and the details that are involved in the record keeping. It's pretty obvious from the narrative that went with the new revisions that the FTC released last week, that one of the big frustrations that they have been dealing with is that they had a statute of limitations that extended beyond their current record keeping requirements, which were only 2 years. And so now for most of these new provisions of record keeping, it's requiring to keep those for 5 years. And in some cases for 5 years from the termination of a contract between a seller and a telemarketer. So a substantial extension of these record keeping requirements. You're also going to be required to update processes and procedures. There is a safe harbor that you'll be able to take advantage of if you do implement policies and procedures. Those policies and procedures have to address compliance with the telemarketing sales rule. You have to implement those procedures. Obviously, you have to train your personnel on it. And then you have to make sure that you're auditing against the application of those policies and procedures, so that if an error does occur, you'll be able to fix it. And if there is any subsequent error that you need a safe harbor for, that it was covered by these policies and procedures that you have implemented. So important to look at those policies and procedures. The D&C timeframe, I thought this was interesting. Apparently the FTC has been experiencing some frustration also with timing of 18 months or 3 months. And so now they put it in terms of days rather than months. So you're going to want to set it to make sure that when you're getting, either have an existing business relationship because you've done business with a consumer, or they've made an inquiry, that you are tracking from the date of the end of those transactions. Obviously, 18 months for an established business relationship where you had an actual transaction with that consumer, or 3 months if it was just an inquiry or an application for services. So talking about contracts, these are high level, the areas that these amendments are addressing, and that will require you to take a look at and make sure that they are covered within your contract. Most of the contracts I review already require compliance with the TSR, the TCPA, similar state laws, privacy regulations, intellectual property, throw in the slew of laws that are included in most contracts. But now specifically addressing who is going to comply with which aspects of the telemarketing sales rule will be required. This is especially important when it comes to assigning responsibility for record keeping requirements and how long those records will be kept. So that's something you're going to want to take a look at for your contracts. Also, it's pretty obvious that the FTC has experienced a lot of frustration with obtaining records from overseas call centers. They also point to the fact that, unfortunately, a lot of the fraud that's been experienced in the United States or the unlawful calling that has occurred has originated from certain overseas contact centers and areas. And so now they are requiring that the sellers that are located in the United States, usually, that they are required to keep the records that are recorded from that overseas call center. And, just keep in mind that when we're talking about those overseas call centers, we are talking about them being the telemarketers, and they would need to meet the telemarketing record keeping requirements that we're going to be talking about. But it will no longer be an excuse for not being able to provide the FTC with records because it was an overseas call center that wasn't required to maintain those. So they've been very, very specific about that. Also, and this was something we filed comments for PACE, Professional Association for Customer Engagement, when the amendments were originally proposed. And one of the things that we had requested was that there be some type of safe harbor for call detail records that there was an issue with. It's not uncommon that there will be a gap or a lapse in call detail records because of a technology issue. We've seen cases where technology has been updated, and in the course of updating that technology, there's been a lapse in the record keeping, other issues that can come up. So now, if you can't identify at the time that there's an error and remediate that error within 30 days of it occurring, then the FTC is providing a safe harbor. So it was something that we were happy to see in the new rules. There are also new formatting requirements for call detail records. We're going to go into that in a minute. But basically, it is the type of call detail records that are required to be maintained, and then also the length of time that those call detail records must be maintained for. The other thing that the FTC was careful to point out is that when you have a contract between a seller and a service provider or a telemarketer, the name that's going to be used to place those marketing calls is required to match the name in the contract. That would mean, I'm assuming, although the FTC has not provided any clarification around this, but if the seller also has a DBA and the DBA is going to be used on that call, that should be referenced in the contract. And I don't think that that is something that we are typically seeing in contracts. So make sure those contracts are addressing the items that are on this slide. All right, record keeping. Let's just, we're going to go through these quickly. There's a lot of it. I want to be respectful of the 30 minutes that you've given to me today to go through this with you, but there are a lot. And again, these slides are available after this on our website. So first of all, the advertisements. These are things that have been required in the past, but they have clarified what exactly they mean by the advertisements that will be required to be kept. They did clarify that it's not every advertisement. So if you're running the same ad, but you're running it on different platforms or in different publications, you don't need to keep that each publication or each platform. You would only need to keep records of that advertisement or keep records of that advertisement if it was substantially different than the others. So when you're making, minor changes, maybe to a date within an advertisement that a sale would end or something like that, that's probably not a substantial change. But those are things that you'll want to take a look at and work through with your attorney as to what would be considered substantial for different advertisements. That applies to brochures, telemarketing scripts, and any other promotional materials that you're using, as well as they specifically pointed out any pre-recorded messages that you're using. So if you are initiating calls using a pre-recorded message, anyone that is substantially different will require to be maintained with your record keeping. With regard to the call information, so for each telemarketing call that's placed, your call detail records need to include all of this information. So first of all, the telemarketer that placed the call. And the FTC did clarify they were not talking about the individual person that was making that telemarketing call, but rather the company, the telemarketing company or service provider that was making that call. Also, the seller or the person for which the call is placed, the goods or services or the charitable purpose of the call. So you need to understand what and keep records of what was being sold on those calls. Also, whether it was just a live outbound call or a pre-recorded message or, AI now also. Also, the call detail records, you have to keep the telephone number for who's calling. The telephone number who's calling, also the called number, so the name of the telephone number of the consumer or business that you are calling, date and time and duration. Actually, I misspoke there. I didn't mean to put business in there. I've got me on the wrong track here with these B2B modifications, but the calling number called to, the date, the time, the duration, the caller ID, and then the disposition of that call. Also, the script that was used during that call, that needs to be kept, as well as those call detail records that you'd be getting from your dialing platform. And if a sweepstakes was used to generate the leads for the marketing campaign that you're engaging in, then you also will need to keep the sweepstakes details related to those call detail records. All right, customer information. So with regard to the customer that is being contacted, and obviously for purposes of this, we're primarily interested in the established business relationship exemptions. And so we're looking at making sure that the customer's name, last known number, last known physical or email address, goods or services purchased, the date of the purchase, the shipment of the goods or the services provided, and then the amount that was provided or paid by the customer. So in your records that you are keeping for each one of those calls that have been made, make sure you have that information. For the established business record, to make sure that you're able to substantiate that you do have an EBR that allows you to call a consumer without scrubbing against the federal do not call registry, you'll need to make sure that you'll be able to provide this to establish that you have that EBR. And that's the name of the customer, last known phone number, the date that they either inquired or made an application that would trigger the inquiry EBR, and then the goods or services for that inquiry EBR that they inquired about. So just not enough to have a date in a record that says EBR starts on a specific day. You're going to need to be able to produce this additional information that the TSR is now requiring. As I mentioned with previous donors, the FTC has clarified what it means to be a previous donor, and they point to the fact that the term donor in the charitable solicitation arena means not only somebody who's actually donated money, but also somebody who's looked at as a potential donor. And so they wanted to clarify that for previous donors, for professional fundraisers to be able to call without having to meet the additional consent requirements, they're going to have to be able to show that they have the name, last telephone number, and the date that the prior donation was made. Employee information. So now we're talking about the employees that are making the actual telemarketing calls. A lot of call centers will use fictitious names for their calling agents to avoid issues that sometimes calling agents may run into by identifying who they are to individuals. And the FTC is not concerned about the actual person identified on the call as much as it being able to identify who actually made that call. And so if you are using fictitious names, it's good to see that the FTC is saying that that is a practice that's allowed, but it must be traceable to one specific employee. So don't use the same fictitious name for all of your calling agents. Make sure you can go back to a specific one. You'll also need their last known home address and telephone number. The FTC uses that because when they are initiating a case, frequently they will look to prior employees to be able to provide information and testimony to them. So they want to be able to collect that information from you. Also the job title, so they'll know what type of responsibilities that employee had within the call center. So for verifiable authorization, basically what we're looking at here is the dates that they were providing consent and being able to prove when that consent was provided. And so the specific information you're going to need for verifiable authorization to make these telephone calls is the name and telephone number of the person providing the consent. Also, you must provide the consent in the same manner and format that it was requested from the consumer. And so if you were using a form, you're going to be required to have to be able to produce that form as well as the content of it. The purpose for which the consent was requested and given, to make sure that any subsequent call is within the scope of that consent, a copy of the consent provided, then also the date. So all of those will need to be included in your record retention schedule. For service providers, they must keep the records of all outbound, sellers must keep all the records of the outbound service providers that they are using. So that includes the contracts with them, when the contracts were signed, the time period for which the contract was in effect, and then you have to keep those records for 5 years from the date of the contract. So that can be a pretty substantial period of time for keeping those records. Okay, we're getting close to the end here, guys, and I'm still able to take a few breaths here, so that's good. As far as internal do not call lists, obviously we know we have to keep an internal do not call list. The information that you have to keep for each entry on that IDNC is the name of the person, the telephone number associated with that, the INDC, who the IDNC was directed to. It could be the telemarketer, it could be the seller. If there's a specific name of this, obviously the specific name of the seller, so you'll be able to track that to the seller's IDNC list. The telemarketing company that called, the date it was received, and the goods or services offered if it was, or if it was for charitable purposes, the charity. So all of those things need to now be kept for an IDNC. Most of the time now for IDNCs, what I see is that only telephone numbers are being retained. To the extent that this other information is provided, you are required to maintain it. I will say there are a lot of instances where you are not able to get this information. And so being able to note why you don't have it, for instance, if you don't have the name of the person making the request, they're just providing their telephone number, obviously, you're not going to be able to identify that. So to the extent that that information is provided. This is something important that I wanted to talk about, DNC registry records. And so there are a lot of companies out there that will purchase a DNC list once and then they'll use it for multiple entities. And that's done in a number of different kinds of business models. But just the fact that the DNC list is being shared, but not downloaded by the entity that has the scrubbing requirement. So I want to distinguish that. So if you are a seller and you are required to scrub against the do not call list, it is not good enough for your contact center to use a single SAN number to download the National Do Not Call Registry and then use that list across multiple customers. Each seller that's required to scrub against the do not call list, the FTC has clarified, is required to have a subscription access number to download the do not call registry. And that has to be identified with that specific seller. So for purposes of showing that you scrubbed against the do not call list, if you don't have consent for calls, you're going to have to be able to provide the name of the entity that accessed it. That could be a service provider that you're relying on to download it for you, the date they accessed it, and then the SAN that they used to access that registry. So your SAN, not a SAN that's shared universally across multiple sellers. And then the telemarketing campaign for which it was accessed. So what list were you scrubbing against the DNC list? I think we made it in perfect timing. It is 2:30 on the dot. I am, of course, always available for responding to questions. If you have put a question in the chat, I will get back to you on that question. If you still would like to put a question in the chat, go ahead and do that. Also, my email address is on this slide, so feel free to reach out by email if I can provide you with some general direction or information. Been a pleasure spending the afternoon with you. Thanks so much for tuning in and joining me as I go through this very quickly. All right, have a great day. Bye-bye.